Another factor to consider in regard to cult survivors is that their experience of trauma may be quite extensive and may lead to PTSD. What is PTSD? This is from the DSM-5. In the DSM-5 they have only PTSD and not complex PTSD, so you might not get diagnosed with PTSD and not get the help you need, unfortunately. So anyways, what are the symptoms? Re-experiencing symptoms like flashbacks, reliving the event over and over, nightmares, frightening thoughts. Avoidance symptoms, you avoid places, events or objects that are reminders of the experience. Also people. Avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the traumatic event. Feeling detached or unable to connect with loved ones. Arousal or reactivity symptoms. Hypersensitivity, easily startled. So if someone comes into the room, you just jump. Hypervigilance, feeling tense or on edge. You constantly observe and watch for clues. There could be a threat. Difficulty sleeping, insomnia. You cannot fall asleep or you wake up in the middle of the night and cannot fall asleep. You feel irritability or angry outbursts from 0 to completely enraged from practically nothing. Cognition and mood symptoms. You may have brain fog, trouble concentrating, loss of memory, depression, hopelessness, trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event, feelings of guilt or blame, loss of interest in enjoyable activities, headaches, migraines. And there is increasing evidence that PTSD is not just psychological. No, it isn't. It really changes your brain when you have experienced trauma. And yeah, there is the thing about inflammation or other immune responses. And this is where Dr. Robert Naviaux's research comes in. He talks about the cell danger response. I mentioned that in a previous video. This is why it is not psychological or somatic. Chronic stress triggers long-term changes in your brain structure and function. Chronic stress changes neural networks. Cortisol creates a domino effect that hardwires pathways between the hippocampus and amygdala, in the area responsible for your fight or flight response. The hardwiring caused by stress is not the way your brain was designed, but chronic ongoing stress tricks your brain into rebuilding circuits and hunkering down for the long haul. This rewiring appears to be permanent, unless you intervene with something like any one of the nootropic supplement group that I mentioned at the end of the video and some other tools. Chronic stress seems to flip a switch in stem cells in the brain and then turns them into a type of cell that prevents connections to the prefrontal cortex, preventing improved learning and memory, and laying down the scaffolding linked to anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Chronic stress coats neurons in myelin, reduces the number of neurons and gray matter, decreases while white matter increases. Under conditions of chronic stress and excess cortisol, your brain's neurons are coated or sheeted in myelin. Under healthy condition, this sheeting is a protective measure. But this excessive sheeting is likely an evolutionary measure made to reinforce the connection between the hippocampus and amygdala, improving the fight or flight response during extended periods of threat or attack. The chronic stress that is caused if you have been in hurricanes, but literally a hurricane can be a cult because emotionally you are on a roller coaster. You are forced to become somebody you are not. Already that is very stressful. You are forced to follow a dogma. You are forced to obey and follow the rules. If you do not, then you are shamed and shunned and punished or criticized. All of that is massive stress. If that is going on for many years, that's trauma. And that is when you get PTSD and you have a very narrow window of tolerance. That means any small trigger will put you into fight or flight or freeze response. And there is a fourth stress response nobody talks about, which is fawn. In my opinion, how I have experienced it, what you do in a cult is fawn. You play nice, you play along, you obey, even if you don't want to, even if you feel this makes no sense. Fawn is a stress response created to survive a hostile environment. But this backfires in daily life after traumatic event, like a hurricane, like leaving a cult, in which you are no longer in physical danger. But the good news is post-traumatic stress disorder is curable. If you have the necessary support, if you work with tools and the proper therapeutic modalities, which should be body-oriented, brain-wise, and with that I mean somatic experience, neurofeedback is okay, EMDR is good, sensory motor psychotherapy, and it should be with a therapist that knows about trauma, but also is informed about cults, knows about narcissistic abuse, and comes from a right brain dominant way of understanding and seeing and hearing you, believing you, and not dismissing you, because that would re-traumatize you. That's what you have experienced in the cult. So you need a therapist that is very warm and welcoming and open and interested and doesn't see you through the lens of a diagnosis or cult survivor, but sees you as human being from nervous system to nervous system. That's very important. So you can work on the nervous system together, from right brain dominance to right brain, and then the mirror neurons everybody has will really help you to regulate and heal your trauma. Risk factors for PTSD include being exposed to sexual assault, interpersonal violence, or physical abuse, witnessing domestic or community violence, being exposed to a traumatic event that elicits extreme fear of injury or death, being victim of neglect by a caregiver, and being exposed to traumatic events that occur repeatedly over time. Additionally, individuals exposed to multiple traumatic events are also at greater risk for PTSD than those exposed to a single stressor. Rosen also notes that a different form of PTSD called complex PTSD or C-PTSD may arise after prolonged and repeated trauma. She recommends that therapists with clients who have survived toxic groups or relationships read as much as possible on C-PTSD. This is a very good book on complex PTSD.
In this chapter, we describe the healing that is available through the 4 practices of grieving: angering, crying, verbal ventilating, and feeling.
After leaving the cult, you may probably read a lot from ex-members or learn about cults in general, and this is very important because you need to understand what actually was done to you, how you were brainwashed and manipulated. You need to understand it because it helps you to heal. But then you might have several phases of anger and of grief. You will cry for all the loss or regret you feel for having been so betrayed. And you will feel anger and rage because your trust was abused and all the energy and time and labor you gave. It wasn't what you thought it was. So those are a lot of things to process. And for anger management, it is good if you have a punching bag or a pillow, doesn't matter, but I prefer a punching bag. So get it out of your system, because usually in cults, one is not allowed to show emotion such as anger, grief, or sadness. You are supposed to look happy, to be enthusiastic. and smile all the time, right? So after the cult, this may be the first time for a long time that you are allowed to actually feel and express those emotions. And you might feel ashamed at first to do that in front of another person. So it is good if you have that punching bag in your own apartment and you can do it in private whenever you feel rage. So this is a good tool to work on anger and rage, because it will definitely come out of your system as after effect for all the betrayal you faced. Dilemmas in living for those with C-PTSD can be complicated and painful, and they should be met with informed care. I agree. But also for oneself, read as much as you can about cults, about trauma, and about C-PTSD. Also read about narcissists or the so-called dark triad. It will really help you to understand what has happened to you and peel away the layers of manipulation that you have been exposed to, and also prevent another such thing from happening. Trauma changes the brain. So that's why therapy, in particular somatic experience, EMDR or neurofeedback, are very important. So your brain gets retrained to think in different patterns. That's another book by Robert Cialdini. And this book explains the psychology of why people say yes and how to apply these understandings.
The second important thing to understand is that we too have our pre-programmed tapes, and although they usually work to our advantage, the trigger features that activate them can be used to dupe us into playing them at the wrong times.
Many of our narrators lamented over the fact that it was practically impossible to find a good therapist with knowledge about cults and their after effects. Most of the therapists they encountered didn't recognize the symptoms of PTSD or C-PTSD and therefore couldn't meet their needs. Along with an understanding of PTSD and C-PTSD, familiarity with relational trauma can help cult survivors begin to integrate and heal. Leona Furnari, a licensed clinical social worker who has counseled cult survivors for decades, notes that family issues and trauma are linked for many of these survivors. Treatment usually focuses on the cult experience first, and then family of origin issues, if there are any. Cult survivors face many complex issues and hurdles, yet, even without proper support, many find their way to health, integration, and wellness. Of course, this process can be rocky, discouraging, and frustrating, even for individuals whose resilience is high. Rosen, a relational psychotherapist who has worked with cult survivors for over 30 years, notes that labeling former cult members as pathological merely increases their guilt, shame, and isolation. This stigma both isolates cult members from the outside world and gives outsiders a very limited and often incorrect view of cult members and cult survivors. Rosen notes that if trauma from cult involvement is about loss, dissociation, boundary ruptures, and betrayal, then healing impacts growth in connection, integration, self-recovery, self-respect, and trust. Healing is also about learning how to live in a world of ambiguity and multiple relationships, including group involvement. It involves understanding layers of cultural identity and the sense of otherness that comes with a stigmatized experience. Resilience is a person's capacity to confront, manage, and heal from stressful and traumatic events. In this hopeful book about human resilience, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton introduced the concept of the protean self, or the evolving self. Lifton writes, rather than collapse under these threats and pulls, the self turns out to be surprisingly resilient. It makes use of bits and pieces here and there, and somehow keeps going. What may seem to be mere tactical flexibility or just bungling along turns out to be much more than that. We find ourselves evolving, a self of many possibilities, one that has risks and pitfalls, but at the same time holds out considerable promise for the human future. I can't emphasize enough to just be patient with yourself. It's going to take a long time, but don't be embarrassed. This was done to you. It's nothing to be ashamed of. You might need to learn discretion about sharing of yourself and discernment, but you don't have anything to be embarrassed about. Whatever was done to you, whatever the spectrum of abuse or manipulation, it was done to you. It was nothing you deserved. You don't have to be embarrassed about anything. You should get out. It's great out here. There's freedom. But what you omit is that it's also really hard. You have nightmares. You doubt your decision. You miss the people you grew up with or grew fond of if you joined the cult as an adult. And you don't tell people this because you want them to get out. But it is hard, and you're going to deal with a lot of issues. But you have to deal with that and just take it. Take it. It's kind of like bankruptcy, you know. The creditors are calling you, you're drowning. You finally get out of that, and it's great. But then you start your life over, and it's hard. You have to revamp your whole way of thinking, which you do when you're out. You have to revamp your whole way of thinking and start over. Surviving and thriving. Trauma, resilience, and integration. When you decide to leave, make it definitive. Set up a good plan before you leave. A good game plan. Don't just run away and go out on the street. Set up a good plan. Have a good network out there. Find one. If you have one person, find that one person and then make your support group bigger. That ties into making it definitive. Make a strong decision that you're going to get out. Get your mind clear and then stick with it. I think this is really important. It took me about a year until I was ready to leave. Emotionally, mentally, and then I also used the time to find a job when I had a torn ligament and I was at home for almost 3 months. During that time, I read about cults, I did my research, and I built up my new life outside of the cult. And before I had this accident, I took already Tai Chi lessons. So I knew a few people that were not in the cult. Yeah, and then the last time I went to New York celebrations, I really gave everything away, but I kept everything very secretive. I just said something like, yeah, I will not come to New York that often anymore, and I might take a hotel instead because it's too much to sleep with 6 people in one room for 2 weeks. Well, and I just cleaned up my stuff and I went sightseeing that last celebration. I did not attend one single celebration or meditation. I was outside all the time, going shopping, buying books and stuff. That was actually the only vacation in New York that was like a sightseeing tour. What you usually do on a vacation when you visit a new place. In over 10 years, that was the only time I went sightseeing and shopping and stuff like that. It's funny. Yeah, but really have a good, solid plan. And take your time. Don't rush it. Prepare yourself. It's way better because it is hard to suddenly be thrown out into the world outside of the cult. It's really different. You have to get used to it. So prepare yourself as good as you can. And what I would tell myself now in retrospect is I should have connected with a psychologist that was specialized in cults and talked about this. But I might do that now, because now I'm also able to talk. Back then, when I left, I was still quite shy and still brainwashed, and I had to peel away all of that stuff. And now I feel like I'm really more myself, the core self, and not the cult self. I had to shed that, and maybe it was too early back then to talk to anybody, because there was still so much distrust. Lifton equates resilience with wisdom, noting that despite childhood trauma, many of us are able to transmute that trauma into various expressions of insight, compassion, and innovation. We humans appear to have the capacity to absorb suffering and learn from it, as evidenced by the recovering and recovered lives of the 65 cult survivors Janja interviewed for this book. Researchers Stephen Southwick and Dennis Charney call resilience complex, multidimensional, and dynamic in nature. They studied resilience in relation to PTSD in adults, adolescents, and children. Through in-depth interviews with many highly resilient individuals, former Vietnam prisoners of war, special forces instructors, and civilians who endured and even thrived after surviving great stress and trauma. Yeah, but you definitely need a lot of support to get there. You need to work on the trauma. You can't just let it sit and fester. You have to work on it. And what best helped me was the somatic experience I did for a year. And I'm now doing something else because the insurance pays for that, but not for the somatic experience. Probably I will go back to somatic experience because this really works so well for me. I have made a lot of progress when I compare myself where I used to be and where I'm now. There is now way more balance in thinking. I used to be so black and white. And now it's more seeing the big pictures and looking at both sides of the coin. When you are just very left hemisphere dominant, you slide into this narrow-sightedness. The left brain has narrower focus and is more goal-oriented. Its tendency is to isolate parts from the whole and to see them in the abstract. It favors consistency and repeatability, likes to categorize, classify, and to predict. It sees cause and effect, and seeks to manipulate the world through tools, the most important of these being language. It likes things to be explicit and cannot deal with contradiction. This makes it both very literal and, being also the half of the brain that processes anger, dogmatic. It willfully ignores anything outside its model of the world, so it lives in a self-referential hall of mirrors, ensuring an optimistic outlook. It controls language but has little gift for music. with a limited appreciation for anything much beyond rhythm. A poor perception of depth, and little appreciation of its place in time, and struggles alone to see or recognize anything in the left visual plane. Ian McGilchrist's book offers a provocative hypothesis. He asserts that humanity flourishes when there is hemispheric balance in the way a given population attends to the world. When the left brain dominates, he says, you see greater abstraction and a literal flattening of culture. Ways of thinking are imitated and so reinforced across a population, and the self-referential nature of the left brain makes it difficult for it to see any other point of view. So groupthink and dogma set in. Left brain attention has undoubtedly moved business and scientific inquiry forward, but McGilchrist asserts, for all its brilliance, an increasingly dominant left brain mode of operating in the West is also causing many of today's ills, from environmental change to mental health problems, and its hallmarks can be seen in everyday culture around us. So you see, in a cult, that mind control will totally push you into left brain dominance. And then this happens. Left brain makes it difficult to see any other point of view, and dogma sets in. This is what happens to you when you join a cult and are brainwashed. And then this weird thing happens. You go into this cognitive dissonance, and nothing somebody would say could actually get through to you. You are seeing everything through the brainwashed lens, and everything that doesn't belong into the cult's dogma, you just leave it out, you ignore it. Diet is a big thing, so I was vegetarian for 19 years and then 4 years veganism, and this ruined my health. But now I have restored my health to a big part, and mainly because now I am in mild ketosis. That means my body burns animal fat, meaning you gain energy from fat. In my case, animal fat, instead of glucose. So there are no sugar spikes anymore, and the mood is quite stable. And that stability will really support your healing from trauma and PTSD. But I also started using this David Delight Pro device, which is audio visual brain entrainment for PTSD. And a while back I started also including the so-called nootropics, and this is the alternative form of psychotropics. They have no side effects and are not dangerous and not addictive. Many are even natural. If you have PTSD, your brain is changed, and it can help when you work with nootropics. I wish back then, when I left the cult, I would have known about all those tools, and that's why I'm sharing those in this video. It took me many years to get where I am now, and I used different tools, all interchangeably. They complement each other, so that's why I combine them. And I would say when you leave a cult, you are basically in a similar stress state as if you have lost your home, because you have lost your home. You have lost all the people that you may have known for many years. You have lost your foundation. You have lost your beliefs. You have to find a new job outside of the cult and work with people you don't know. So all of that, it's very stressful. And then you have to learn new job skills, new communication skills. It can be really challenging. So that's why I say, help your brain to catch up and use some good nootropics. I have used ashwagandha for quite some years now. It helps with anxiety. And when I take it, I don't get so stressed. I feel more energetic, enthusiastic. I always say it's better than coffee. Coffee is also a nootropic, and it really helps to calm my brain, as weird as this sounds. But if your brain has changed, you might have ADHD tendencies, you can't focus so well. So that's why coffee or ashwagandha or both can come to the rescue. And I so love lithium orotate. And this is not the same as lithium. Know the difference. Here we are talking about microdosing lithium in the form of lithium orotate for treating the symptoms of PTSD. Supplementing with lithium orotate has been shown to stabilize mood, prevent depression, and even suicide. Lithium orotate will help put a stop to outbursts of rage and reduce anxiety. And this is really helpful. I love this supplement. Whenever I take it, I just feel happier. Really. It's that powerful. And I just take about 3 capsules per day. That's all. That's not much. If you are familiar with the window of tolerance, when you have PTSD, your window of tolerance is very narrow. That means very small things can trigger a stress response. So you feel anxious, you have sudden rage, anger. You may start to cry. This is the fight or flight that is activated. Or you go into the freeze shutdown. You withdraw. You may have a hard time to talk or express anything Your breathing is very shallow. You dissociate. And your facial expression is very flat. There is no emotion in your face, and that's difficult for other people to read you. But also when you are in a stress response, be it fight or flight or freeze, you have also difficulty or connect to people, and you see people from a different lens. You see it from a state of survival. So basically, every person is a threat to your system. So that's so important that you actually calm down your brain and that you don't feel stressed. It makes life much more comfortable, and also your body will thank you. Another good nootropic that I have tested is SAM-E. I use the one from this company, and it's really helpful for emotional well-being, liver function, even joint health and comfort, joint mobility. But what I also experience, my executive functioning is way, way better. I'm just doing things, not thinking about doing things and then never do things. I just do it. It's also helpful for depression, PMS, anxiety. It is good to take SAM-E together with other nootropics from the B vitamin family, B6, B12, B9, folate. Another very, very important one is thiamine, vitamin B1. And this is not only for PTSD important, it helps with improved focus, memory, chronic pain, depression and anxiety. But what it also does, this is not for a thiamine deficiency per se, but rather when you take megadoses, and with megadoses I mean 1500 milligram up to 2000 milligrams per day. This is based on the research of Dr. Derek Lonesdale. He wrote a book about it and has done many studies. And when you megadose thiamine, it will kick back some dormant enzymes into function that are thiamine dependent, and that's for mitochondrial function. Very, very important. Thiamine turns nutrients into ATP, and this is the cellular energy. Thiamine helps for brain optimization. So your brain will work properly, and mood function, so you are more stress resilient. For a PTSD brain, this is very important.